First of all, I think the danger of science ever explaining everything is really far in the future. It's not to say we shouldn't consider it. I think we're a long way away from that. However, just say, boom, science can explain everything. For me, it does not take mystery or curiosity out of the picture, nor does it take spirituality out of the question, because scientists cannot, I don't think, ever answer the question of why. Right? They can answer how. How did our brains develop like this? But they're not really going to get to the heart of that human experience. I mean, I think that's the ineffable part. And I think I believe, as a matter of faith, you might say, that there will always be a mystery. So I'm not bothered by attempting to understand how the emotional brain works. And in fact, I think some of it's really good for lending a credibility and a validity to experiential knowledge that has been really devalued. So I think it's really important to consider the ways in which the right side of the brain experience, emotional experience, experiential knowledge, and I would say they're all very much related. How those things fit into the kind of class, gender, race critiques that we read about in 618, and you may have read about in other classes as well. That is to say, the ways in which experiential learning, emotional knowledge, emotional intelligence has been gendered in different cultures. You can't make any great statements about this because I think universalizing statements, because in different cultures, even subcultures, those emotions, that emotional life, that experiential type of learning is valued or devalued according to the mores and the structure of those cultures. But I think it's important that we consider how that happens. And if we're looking at American culture overall, I think there is obviously a certain patterns that follows, whereby the emotional experience, the experiential experience is linked in a gendered way to being considered a less credible form of knowledge. Maybe the last thing I'm going to say about Bolte Taylor right now is something that Sean said, and not to pick on you, Sean, but I found it really interesting that, as far as I remember, Bolte Taylor is the only author that someone, and I'm not going to pick on you, Sean, because a lot of folks jumped on this bandwagon, that it felt necessary somehow to remind us all that hers is just one experience of many. And the reason I find this interesting is for two things. One is that she's a woman, and two is that she's coming from a place where she is collapsing the experiential knowledge with the scientific knowledge, right? And that's very unnerving to the scientists. So the critique of her from scientists, where Sean, I think, somebody said they would cringe, it makes them very uncomfortable. But what I want to say that we can't forget is that every one of those scientists brings as much emotion and as much point of view and as much of an agenda and as much subjectivity as Bolte Taylor does. I believe that almost as a matter of faith. And it's just a matter of whether you acknowledge it or you don't. And this is one of the reasons why I think her work is extraordinary, is because she not only acknowledges it, but she really does try to make some sort of synthesis between experiential knowledge and scientific knowledge. this is, obviously it wasn't the last thing I wanted to say on Bolte Taylor. A couple things, so I don't just pick on Sean. I noticed a nervousness about, and I know Father Tom mentioned it, but some others may have mentioned it as well, about so-called peer-reviewed literature versus popular literature like Pollan and Taylor. And I would suggest that all of the questions I just raised about the difference between experiential learning and scientific learning, or so-called factual knowledge, we consider when we consider the question of peer review and scholarship. I work at a journal, and I know that an academic peer-reviewed journal, and in my experience and my opinion, the work that we publish is no less has no less of an agenda than the work that's published in the New Yorker, or the New York Times as journalism, or some other magazine. And I think there's a question of degrees when you start dipping into the People magazines of the world and the E! Entertainment Network coverage. But peer reviewers have an agenda, journal editors have an agenda, and I know we have an agenda. I mean, in our journal we have an agenda that we will publish stuff that a lot of other people won't publish, because it can tend to be very critical of corporations that produce chemicals and things that damage the environment and public health. So there are scientists out there working on very important and significant and enormous scientific studies that aren't getting published in peer review because they're critical of, say, the nuclear power industry. And I can give you a really specific example if you'd like. So just ask me. So I think for me, the overall, how I would summarize this whole business is first of all, to consider emotions as a form of knowledge, okay? And to be able to understand and work with emotions as a form of intelligence, emotional intelligence. Second of all, to consider that the ways in which that experience has been devalued and discredited for a number of different reasons, and why, in very specific terms. Third of all, to consider the ways in which science is kind of remarkably closing that gap a little bit by working out these scientific mechanisms of our emotional life, and thereby potentially giving it credibility as a form of knowledge. And I guess fourth, these aren't in any particular order, the role that language plays in all of this, especially since our right brain, it's going to look like left to you on the video, our right brain is without language, essentially, right? So what role does language play in all of this mediation of experience and knowledge? And then 5, I would say, to really be very, very careful about questioning when we think of things as either subjective or objective, when we think of things as real knowledge or real fact versus anecdotal information or popular information, we really question the mechanisms by which that knowledge is produced in both cases, and to try to avoid being reductionist about it, so that we see one as sort of the pinnacle of achievement and another as, we lump it all together with People magazine or something. I mean, I know that's a broad overstatement of what folks were saying, but so that's it on Bolte Taylor right now, for right now.